Hey guys, welcome back to Breakfast and Bible. Today we're going to talk about Leah. Leah is a very interesting character, and I think it's important to talk about her because I feel like she is one of the women that many of us can relate to. She experienced a lot of different things, a lot of different struggles, and I think that realistically, she goes through a lot of things that women today go through. So I want to talk about her and what we can learn from her life, if anything, and what she went through. So let's jump straight into it. From the get go, the introduction that we get to Leah is not a flattering introduction, okay? We're told that Laban has two daughters. One is Leah, she is the eldest, and the other is Rachel, the youngest. And the way they're described is that Leah's eyes are weak, but Rachel is beautiful. Now, I've heard a lot of controversy about what it means that Leah's eyes were weak. Some people think she was cross-eyed. Others think that it just is a contrast to Rachel being beautiful. At the very least, we can assume that Rachel was like a model. Like in today's world, we're talking about, Instagram model, we're talking about Beyonce, we're talking about, the girl that guys stop and stare at. And Leah was basically a plain Jane. I don't necessarily know if that phrase means cross-eyed. I looked up the original definition, and it looks like it could mean weak, it could mean tender. Some translations will say tender, some will say weak. I kind of see her more as just being kind of this plain Jane, kind of soft-spoken, in the background, shy type of a girl that kind of pretty much gets passed by in terms of when people are looking at people. And of course, in that culture, in many cultures, it was considered rude for the younger daughter to marry before the elder daughter. So a lot of times, men would put stipulations out there. Fathers would say that you couldn't marry their younger daughter until the older daughter was married. And in this case, we see that Laban actually tricks Jacob into marrying Leah to marry her off first. Now, I do think that it's important to think about why it is that Laban tricked her. Let's zoom in a little. So one of the first things that I asked myself is, why does Laban trick Jacob into marrying Leah? I get that in many cultures, like I said, it was considered rude or improper for the younger daughter to marry first. But the fact that Laban had to trick Jacob into marrying her means that there were no suitors out here trying to marry her. In theory, it is also possible that Laban saw Jacob as an excellent mate for one of his daughters. He wanted partnership with Jacob because Jacob was growing his herd. We see this as the time goes by. He wants Jacob to stay. He doesn't want Jacob to leave. He wants Jacob to continue to do great things for his flock. And Jacob was a prosperous man, so he would have been an eligible bachelor. And maybe the other guys in town were just not up to par per his standard for what he wanted to marry his daughters. But it's also possible that no one wanted to marry Leah. And this is why he was trying to kind of pawn her off onto Jacob. But essentially, the entire story of Leah that we get is that she was the eldest daughter. She was kind of given over to Jacob when he didn't want her in the first place. She's not beautiful, and she has 6 sons and 1 daughter. That's pretty much all we get about Leah. I did look up her name. Her name actually means weary, which I think is pretty fitting considering the life that she lived. And here I wrote out the names of her offspring. She gives birth to sons first. So the oldest 4 sons of Jacob and the first four tribes of Israel, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, she then gives her maid to Jacob to bear children. And then after that, ends up having Issachar and Zebulun, or Zebulun, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And then finally has a daughter, Dinah. And I think it's interesting because her oldest four sons have the most interesting history, and it is from Judah that that we get the Messiah, that we get King David, that we get King Solomon. It is Leah's descendants that we remember the most. It is the Levites who inherit the temple. So her children are very much blessed above Rachel's, even though we do see, a great story about Rachel's son Joseph, and Jacob loved, her and her sons more. We do definitely see God blessing Leah in an abundance through her children. So the first things that I really asked myself talking about Leah was, why did she agree to her father's deceit? Like, I mean, there's so many questions that go along with this, right? Like, did she actually have a choice? Did she like Jacob? Did she love him? Like, how did this go down? Like, I try to imagine, like, she's sitting there and her father's like, okay, Jacob has asked to marry Rachel, and so you're going to marry Jacob. Like, in some ways, I wonder if the father lied to her and said, Jacob wants to marry you, and she agreed because she thought Jacob wanted to marry her. Though Jacob had been around for 7 years working for Rachel's hand, and we see that upon first meeting Rachel, he kisses her. So I would think it would be obvious that Jacob was there trying to woo and court Rachel and not Leah. So the Bible doesn't really give us a good picture of how that exactly went down. And like I said, whether or not Leah goes into this marriage actually caring about Jacob or loving Jacob. And so I really do wonder, I would love to have seen like a women's version of the Bible. Like, if, while the men had been recording events, the women had been recording events as well, and we got to see their side of the story. I do know that someone wrote The Red Tent, which is supposed to give, an interpretation of Leah's daughter, Dinah. And it also obviously goes into some details about Leah and Rachel, and it's told more from a women's point of view. However, I haven't read the actual book. I have seen the miniseries. The miniseries seems very much not Christian, so I don't necessarily recommend it. There were some parts of it that I found very interesting and very fascinating. But I haven't gotten around to read the book yet. It's on my to-read list to see if it's also kind of skewed away from Christianity. But it does at least tell me I'm not the only one who really would like to hear this story from their side. I do hope that they're both in the kingdom, and that when all is said and done, I can sit there and listen to them talk about this. But for now, we just have the questions. How did this happen, Leah? How did you end up married to your sister's beloved? Right? Like, just how? But nonetheless, the closest amount of information, or the most amount of information we get about the life that Leah lived, how she felt, where she was mentally and emotionally, is revealed in the names of her children and what she says when she has them. So the first son that she has is Reuben. His name means behold a son. And right after she has him, she says, surely God has looked on my affliction. Her affliction being that she wasn't the beautiful daughter that Jacob loved Rachel more. And in this society, having a son was everything. That was the most important thing. And she was the one who was blessed with a son. And for a long time, she was the only one having children at all. Rachel wasn't even having girls. She just wasn't having kids. So Leah's reaction to her first child is like, yeah, power move, sort of like that. And that's why she is behold a son. Her second son is Simeon, which means heard. And she says, because the Lord has heard, I was hated. So even after having Reuben, Jacob still is not loving Rachel. Leah. This did not make him turn away from Rachel. It didn't make him fall in love with Leah. He was still, gung ho about his wife who was childless. And she's like, okay, well, I am hated in my household, but I'm the one having sons. So from a societal standpoint, she was the one winning. She has her third son, Levi. Levi means joined to. And after she has Levi, she says, now will my husband be joined to me because I have borne him a third son. And it's very interesting because we're seeing a pattern every time she thinks that this son is going to grant her favor with her husband, who is seemingly not caring about her. And as I mentioned earlier, and I asked the question, did she love Jacob? These statements kind of infer that there was a, something there, but at the same time, at this point, she's married to him. She has no other choice. No one wants to be in a marriage by themselves where it's, he's just here because, it's required of him or he has to be there. It's more complicated than that. And I think she just wanted to be loved, right? Like whether or not she really was into Jacob himself, I think at this point it's, I want to be loved too. And it's got to be hard that not only is this other woman, the other woman is your sister, your younger sister. Like that's gotta hurt. And there's gotta be a lot of contention, a lot of jealousy. I cannot imagine that was a peaceful household. Now, where things get interesting is with her fourth son, Judah. Judah means praised. And what she says when she has Judah is, now I will praise the Lord. Her son, Judah, is literally the only son that she has that when she has him, her comments, her naming pattern, it has nothing to do with Jacob. She is just like, I'm praising the Lord. I'm happy. I have a son. And interestingly, it is Judah who bears the lineage of kings for Israel. Judah is the progenitor of the tribe of Judah. That is where we get Boaz, who marries Ruth. That is where we get David. That's where we get Solomon. And of course, that is the lineage of Christ. So I think it's very interesting that that blessing also comes through the son that she is seemingly grateful for without relation to her husband, but just she will praise the Lord, just happy just to be happy. I do find that telling. I find that interesting, and I find that something to take note of. Now, the next son she has, there's a break here. After Judah is where she stops conceiving for a while. She gives Jacob permission to sleep with her handmaid. They have some kids, and her and Rachel are still kind of trying to outchild each other, even though clearly Leah is doing this. But then she starts to conceive again, and she has Issachar. Issachar means there is recompense. And she says, God has given me my hire, for I have given Jacob my maid. And I looked up the word hire. I was pretty sure it meant wages, and it does. So basically she's saying that God has rewarded her because she allowed her husband to sleep with another woman to bear kids. That sounds really bizarre in the minds of a modern, in the modern mind. But I think it was kind of her way of saying, like she was doing what she thought was best, and God is still rewarding her. He had turned away from her because she was barren. And at this point, her only claim to fame has been having kids. Her only use to Jacob has been having sons. Because at this point, Rachel still hasn't had a single kid, not even, her first, not even a daughter, no kids at all, and definitely not her first son. So, you know, God is giving her back that blessing of being able to carry on the family name. And I think that is why she said there is recompense. Then she has Zebulun, which means exalted. And once again, she's saying, I've had 6 sons. Now my husband will dwell with me. And it's still like this idea that he will come to her because she has had sons. And then finally, she gives birth to Dinah, which means judgment. And she doesn't actually say anything after she gives birth to Dinah. She just names her Dinah. And I think this is interesting. I think this is something that is, well, it's very sad, first of all. If you read the story of Leah, you cannot help but feel some kind of like heartbreak and sorrow that it's very obvious that at no point in her life does Jacob feel the same way about her. And even in the memory of the Israelites, I mean, Moses is the one who writes Genesis. And we get, I think, an entire chapter talking about the burial of Rachel. Jacob is distraught when Rachel dies in childbirth. We get a whole chapter. But we just get a very short sentence about Leah's death. I don't know when she died. Assumably she died while they were in Egypt. I'm not really positive. She may have died before they went to Egypt. It's not really clear. And you would think that Moses, being a descendant of Levi, who was a child of Leah, would have favored his mother, his great 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 grandmother, her side of the story over Rachel's. But of course, the Bible is inspired by the Holy Spirit, and the whole point is to tell the message, not to dwell too much on one person or to play favorites or anything like that. And so we don't really get a lot of Leah's story, which is also very sad. It's Jacob never really loved her. She lived her entire life married. She became a mother, and she never really got the love that she was searching for. But her children were, in fact, blessed. So I think that's one aspect of Leah's story that stands out a lot. But another aspect of her story is this concept of having kids to make him love her. There are so many stories I've heard where, people are in marriages that are failing and they're like, I'm going to have a baby to keep my husband. Or even before people have gotten married, this idea of trapping someone by having a child, it has been kind of a thing, right? And not to say that every woman who has a child under these circumstances is doing it for that reason, but there have been people who have, and we see right here from the Bible that it doesn't work. Even though society placed a lot of value on a woman's ability to have a son, I find it interesting because a lot of times society dictates what a woman is supposed to be, how she's supposed to be, what she's supposed to wear, what she's supposed to look like. But men aren't, even though they may say these things out loud, when they find the one that they love, a lot of these things don't necessarily matter. So in the case of Jacob, he was in love with Rachel. And when you first read the story of, Jacob and Rachel, it seems very shallow. He saw her, she was beautiful, he fell in love with her. He worked 7 years to get this beautiful woman, and, he was furious about Leah. And so, he had to work another 7 years to get Rachel. And so he does, and he just loves Rachel. If in fact Jacob's love was only skin deep and it was only about her beauty, I am 100% confident that at some point in these 14 years that he worked to get her hand in marriage, she would have become less beautiful. He'd have been like, she ain't really all that though. Like, she ain't that beautiful. And then even if maybe, let's say he was young And she really was that beautiful. At some point, I feel like he would have grown to have some affection towards Leah, and some of this, intense attraction to Rachel would have kind of died down. I don't necessarily think it would have just went until life, till death do you part. I don't know how old Rachel was when she passed away, but she had to have been getting up in age, probably at the point you start to get your little crow's feet, frown lines, and things. You just start to age. That's what life is. And so I do think that Jacob had to have a genuine love for Rachel, and that's why he was never able to return that love to Leah, because it was already taken by Rachel. Otherwise, I think he would have learned to love Leah. And so I think, um, when we're in situations and you think like, oh, if I do this, this is gonna make him love me, or if I do that, and it's not necessarily just the having the kid. It's if I change my hair, if I change how I dress, if I change what I'm interested in. I feel like a lot of times women feel pressure to change themselves to get the attention or to get the love. And as we can see from Leah's story, it doesn't work, because they either love you or they don't. And in Leah's case, he didn't. And so it's a very blunt and sad lesson to learn, but I do think that is one of the takeaways from Leah's story. Now, that being said, I also thought it was interesting that Leah is buried with Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, and Rebecca. So Leah is actually in the family tomb, whereas Rachel was buried on the way to Bethlehem. And I find it interesting because when the Israelites go to Egypt for the famine, they stay there. As Jacob is dying, he makes them promise that when they go back, they will carry his bones. So when they go back, at some point, they carry his, I want to think, I don't remember if it's Joseph or if it's when they leave in the Exodus, but at some point, they take Jacob's bones back to the cave. I can't remember the name of it. It starts with an M, but the cave where Abraham bought to bury Sarah. They go back and they take Jacob's bones there. So Abraham and Sarah are buried there, Isaac and Rebecca, and also Jacob and Leah. But when they are on their way there, Jacob does not carry the bones of Leah to this place. And I find that also interesting, because Rachel is the one that he loved. I would have thought that he would have wanted her buried and honored with the patriarchs. I would have thought he would have wanted to be buried with her, because he could have also said to take his bones back to the site on the way to Bethlehem where he buried Rachel, and he could have asked to be buried with Rachel instead of being buried with Leah and with his ancestors, but he did not. And so I am not exactly sure about that. I find that interesting. I don't know if it means anything. I also wonder if after Rachel died and he had to let go of her and, the fact that she was gone, I wonder if then he started to come around to Leah, and we just don't get that part of the story. But it's food for thought. Now, the last couple of questions that I wrote are, I've sort of touched on them, about how many of us can relate more so to Leah than to Rachel, and what is it that we can learn from Leah. It's a very, very sad story, but I do feel like most of us are not, supermodels. If we were, then supermodels wouldn't be supermodels, right? Like that would just be the norm. That would be average. And so, in fact, most women are average. We are average women. And that means that, we're not necessarily the Rachels. Now, hopefully you have found someone who loves you the way Jacob loved Rachel. But I'm sure we've all had that feeling of, being off on the side and, um, you know, the guy wanting some other girl who, I mean, in this case, Rachel seemed to reciprocate Jacob's affections. But if you're like me, you've been in that situation where you liked a guy and he liked some other girl and she didn't like him, and you're just like, why? Well, why? Right? And so I think that many of us can relate to Leah. As I mentioned before, I think many people have done things to try to get a guy's attention that's not necessarily their natural self, which Leah also seemed to do. But hopefully, we won't all live a life where the guy never loves us, where we never get to feel loved the way Leah did. But I do think that Leah's story tells us that there is more to your creation and your existence than receiving that love. I don't think, even though all we get of Leah is her despair at not being loved by Jacob and the fact that she gave birth to, these sons, she is literally the mother of half of Israel. Half of the tribes of Israel come from Leah, and the most important, the most prominent tribes come from her. The two tribes that did not get lost and just completely go off the rails are descended from her. And so she leaves way more of a legacy than Rachel does, which goes back to the Proverbs 31 statement that, beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. And so even though even though Leah didn't get that fairy tale love and that happy ending that a lot of us want, there was a bigger purpose for her. Now, unfortunately, we don't get to learn anything else about her outside of her being a mother. Was she a great singer? Was she, a great seamstress? Did she dance? Was she a great dancer? Did she tell good jokes? We don't really know what she liked or anything outside of her maternal duties. But I do think that God had a purpose for Leah that was outside of being loved by Jacob. And I think in her case, she wanted sons, so God gave her those sons. And I think that in the same way, he will hear us. As she said, God has heard. And he will try to make amends when we are in poor situations. Now, we would be here forever if we got deep into this story, if we got deep into the questions of, are you supposed to stay in these situations? Was it Leah's place to stay? Was it, if you're unloved, are you supposed to leave? And all of those questions that come along with it. I don't want to go too deep into that because I think, one, I think there's a lot of opinion and assumption that you have to make, but two, I think we would be here all day. But I will say that in the Bible, there were rules about treatment of the first wife and not denying the first wife her right as the first wife. So if you see any culture that actually practices polygamy, the first wife is like the woman of the house, and the second wife and the third wife, or how many ever wives there are considered lesser wives. And so even though Jacob loved Rachel more, Leah was in fact the first wife, which made her the head honcho in the house, essentially. And we see even when Rachel and Leah are bargaining over the mandrake, that, there's also a bargain for who Jacob is going to sleep with that night. And so we see that Jacob is clearly still sleeping with Leah because she's having all the babies. So he's still providing her with the wifely rights, and he is still providing for her financially. We don't get a huge look at this, but likely he was providing, substantially to her for financial well-being. She probably had her own tent and all of this stuff. Um, and so in that regard, he hadn't actually put her aside. He just didn't love her the way he loved Rachel. And we don't actually see evidence of him mistreating her. So it's not like he was abusing her or that he was, whether that's be physically, emotionally, verbally. It's just that she knew that he loved Rachel more. And we all know that. Like you can tell when someone loves someone else or when they love someone else more. And so I think that complicates the situation in terms of, when you're in those situations. Ideally, you don't marry people under false pretenses, so that you don't end up in that situation. Ideally, you're marrying somebody who does love you and you know that they love you and they know that you're you, and you don't end up in this situation. That is what I would definitely say. However, the conversation of whether Leah would have been in her right to leave because he did not love her, I think it's an interesting conversation to have, mainly because if you go into Ephesians, that same chapter that says that a woman is to submit to her husband, says, husbands, love your wives. And so in order to answer that question, we have to really get into the definition of love and whether or not Jacob was loving her, even if he loved Rachel more. Was he still loving her? And I don't really think we have enough details to make those kinds of judgments or final, I was going to say decisions, but I still mean judgments. So yeah, but I do definitely think that it's an interesting concept. It is a question that I've had in my own mind. I just can't answer it. So that's pretty much all I have on Leah and her life. Definitely one of the more heartbreaking women of the Bible, but a woman who endured a lot, and that I definitely understand. Definitely wanted to do her story first because I think she deserved to be first over Rachel for once in her life. We'll talk about Rachel at some other time. And yeah, I'll see you guys again at the next Breakfast in Bible.